Mr. Kukan, members of the European Parliament, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm sure I speak on Paul's behalf as well when I say we're honored to be your guest here this evening, Mr. Kukan, and we are thrilled to have you all here in this occasion and in this building. Just before I take my time to tell you my part of this evening, and by the way, I'm the opening act. Paul is the really accomplished author. This is his third book. This is just my first. So let me just ask very quickly. I know there are probably a lot of Slovaks here. May I ask how many of you are Slovak? Okay, super. Vítajte. Výborně. And may I ask how many of you are Czech? Okay, excellent. Děkuji. So I'm glad you came as well. How many of you who are not Czechoslovak have been to the Slovak or Czech republics? Okay, that's excellent. And anybody else must be a very good friend of Paul or mine. Thank you for coming. It's often said that each life is a story, and so therefore you could say that within the Czech Republic there are 10 million stories, within Slovakia there are 5 million stories. I want to use my time this evening to tell you just one story. And we're celebrating an event that took place 20 years ago, but actually my story, some of which Pan Kukan has already told you a little bit about. I'm not going to tell you 100 years of history, but I am going to go back a little further than 20 years, to 25 years before the Velvet Divorce. The year was 1968. And if we remember what Europe looked like, this is the map of Europe at that time. There's one thing that obviously stands out on that map, and that is the dividing line separating east and west. And obviously the biggest city that was on that border was Berlin, but it's less known that the second biggest city on that border was in fact Bratislava. And in 1968 in Bratislava, there was a student named Juraj, and he was accustomed to hearing stories from his great-grandparents, his grandparents. This is, you can just see here, Juraj's grandfather and his grandmother, who came from the villages of Hrachoviště and Krajine, which are not far from Trenčín, sort of along near the Váh, in the shadows of Čachtice Castle, for those of you who know. And Juraj's grandfather, who also was known as Juraj, would tell him stories of how at the turn of the last century, in fact in 1898, he followed tens of thousands of Slovaks who went to seek their fortune in the United States and North America. He got on a boat, he boarded in Bremen, and got off that ship, steamship in fact. This was the ship, the H.H. Meyer, on Ellis Island in New York. And he was just 17 years old. And when he went, he was there in New York to earn some money and to save it and to bring it home to his village, which was of course then in Austria-Hungary. Now, young Juraj was a student in this school, as a matter of fact, and he would sit in his classroom, look out his window at the Danube, the mighty Danube, which flowed right past his school, and he would dream of having adventures of those like those himself. He imagined getting on a boat, sailing down the river to the sea, and having adventures that he would tell his grandchildren about. But unfortunately, that river, and here's young Juraj as a child, along the Danube. Some of you will recognize Starý Most in the picture as well. When he went after school to the river, or in fact better, up to the castle hill, and looked down across the river, he would see Austrian fields and Austrian villages. But he could not, no matter how much he wanted to, get on his bicycle and go to those fields and those villages because of that iron curtain in between him and them. And it was very real. There were armed guards, there were barbed wire fences. It was impossible for him to go just a few kilometers where he could even see. Also in 1968, as Pan Kukan has told us, it was the year that the leadership of the Czechoslovak Communist Party changed, and Alexander Dubček took over and tried to bring socialism with a human face in a number of reforms to Czechoslovakia. One of the things that he did was he reduced the restrictions on travel. And Juraj was one of the people who took advantage of those eased restrictions, and he had the opportunity that summer to go to Norway on a work exchange program. While in Norway, he woke up on the morning of August 21st, 1968, came down to breakfast with his Norwegian host family, and they gave him terrible news. In the middle of the night, 100,000 troops and 1,000 tanks had invaded the country from the neighboring countries. It was indeed, as Pan Kukan has told us, crushing what was known as the Prague Spring. Juraj was outside of Czechoslovakia. He was in Norway. He had planned to be away for just a matter of weeks. Looked at his suitcase, said, "I'm not going back." Made a decision that changed his life. He did not return for 12 years. What he did was he actually applied for asylum, and there was an outpouring of support. We have to remember this, that in that time, actually, Western Europe and the West generally showed very great support for the citizens of Czechoslovakia, and Juraj quickly was given asylum and a scholarship to finish his studies in Aachen in West Germany. While in Germany, he met an American woman from New York. His name was Anita, and they actually fell in love. They got married in a town outside of New York City where she was from. And they decided to start a family. They returned to Aachen, where Juraj was finishing his studies, and in June of 1971, their first son was born. And they decided if they were going to live in the United States, he had to ask the Czechoslovak authorities for permission to be outside the country longer than his visa would allow. And he asked for this permission, and the authorities refused. They said, if you're going to be leaving us, then you are renouncing your citizenship. You will not get an extension. And so he had to take the very difficult choice to renounce his citizenship and become effectively stateless. That moment on, he started a new life. It was an American life. And so he moved to the United States with his wife and his son. They had a second son. This is Alexander Dubček, many of you know. I'm ahead of my photos. I do want to just pause for a second. We talked about tanks rolling into Czechoslovakia. This is in Náměstí SMP in Bratislava. And I ask you to pay attention to the profile of the building in the background, because that will come up again. By now you've probably guessed, and I think Pan Kukan gave the hint away, that in fact Juraj is my father. This is my American family. You can guess which one is me. And my father turned his back on Czechoslovakia. He did not seek out Czechoslovaks in the United States. He did not teach his children the language. He could not go back to see his family. He changed his name to the more easily pronounced and easily spelled for Americans, J. He became known as J. Zednik. And he gained American citizenship. And as far as he was concerned, that was the future. That was his life. For the rest of us, he would know it. He did not think there would be any reason to do anything differently. I'm going to ask maybe if there's still some people outside. If you want to come in, maybe we can still make room, please. But of course, as Pan Kukan has told us, in 1989, everything did change. And it changed radically. I remember being a student at university myself and seeing the Berlin Wall fall, and in the days and weeks that followed, the demonstrations that became the Velvet Revolution brought democracy to Czechoslovakia. And I was a student journalist, and I was hungry to see this with my own eyes. And so I took that Christmas vacation of my university, and I went to Bratislava to connect with my grandparents. I was lucky enough to be there just in 11 days, but in that time that I was there, President Václav Havel gave his first speech as president of Czechoslovakia, his first speech that he delivered in Slovakia as president. And I squeezed myself into the second row in Náměstí SMP and took this photograph. It was thrilling. Some of you may have been there yourselves. To be able to, and you know some of the other people probably in this photograph as well. To soak in that post-revolutionary atmosphere was, for me, just absolutely mind-boggling and amazing, and I felt like this was a place that I had known nothing about. This was a country that was half of my heritage, and I was only just starting to know anything about it, and I wanted to know more. And so the last year of university, I spent my Christmas holiday again in Bratislava, again visiting my grandparents, and again there were historic events. That was, of course, New Year's Eve 20 years ago when Czechoslovakia split, Slovakia became an independent country. Notice again, please, Náměstí SMP, the building that I showed you before. But here is an army of a very different sort. This was at the stroke of 12. For the first time, the Slovak National Army was presented to the Slovak population as its own national military. And so this was a ceremony. This was not an invasion. And again, this is a photograph that I took on New Year's Eve 20 years ago. For me to experience both of these events, and again, I'm sure many of you were in the same square as I was that evening, was amazing, and I decided I needed to not just visit, I wanted to live in Slovakia. And the following year, I made that decision to move to Bratislava. I made that decision just weeks before I found out that my grandfather was diagnosed with a brain tumor. And so I moved to Bratislava. This was the first night that I was back in Bratislava with my grandparents. He was given just weeks to live. And during that time, I finally got to know my family. My grandfather hung on for about 1.5 years. And during that time, my father made many more visits. He was able to finally reconnect with his home country, with his friends, with his family, and he decided to reapply for Slovak citizenship, which he then gained. And with all of this happening, and during the 6 years that I spent in Bratislava, I decided I also wanted to think about being a Slovak citizen. And when I asked the Slovak officials, what do I need to prove that I deserve Slovak citizenship? Of course, there are many things you need when you apply for citizenship. Police records and education records and birth certificates and marriage certificates and all sorts of things. But they said, in fact, for you, Pan Zednik, we need one thing. You say your father was a citizen when you were born. Can you prove that? And so I had to find that document. And luckily, my father still had it. And it showed that in October 1971, when I was 4 months old, he lost his citizenship. And so I was entitled to Czechoslovak citizenship then and to Slovak citizenship now. And so I'm very pleased to say I'm now a very, very proud citizen of Slovakia, as well as a citizen of the United States. And for me, the country which had been lost has been found for my father, for myself, and I would say for the world. The country is much more known in the world than it was ever before, thanks to the events of 20 years ago and all the achievements that have happened since. And it's thanks to many of the people here who are in the room who have helped build, and I thank first and foremost Paul Kukan for building an independent Slovakia that is widely respected around the world and makes people like myself, my family, but I know many others, extremely proud. I've written a book about it. It's called A Country Lost Then Found, and I'm happy to answer any questions later. But what I'm going to do before that is turn the floor over to my good friend Paul Kaye, who I've known for 20 years since he and I both were living in Bratislava. Paul Kaye.